Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast. This is a long game episode. We've talked about it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and today we are going to begin the marathon. What do you think?
Yeah, in some cases, it's even an ultra marathon, right? So, marathon at 26.2, I'm talking like 31 miles, like
Yeah,
maybe even
100
a
miler.
50 miler,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, this is definitely go
If you're
ahead.
doing perennials, it's definitely like you're looking at a 100 miler,
Oh
throw
yeah.
some fruit trees in there.
Yeah, for sure. So we're just going to take it down and we're going to break it down for you. This is how we plan our gardens so that we can get multiple seasons in. At minimum, across the board, 3 seasons.
Mhm.
4 seasons, even better. Is it possible? Absolutely. Just depends on what you want to do with it. So that's what we're doing. But before we get started, I got a couple things to tell you. Welcome back to the Backyard Gardens podcast, everybody. I am your host, Ben, and I am with Batavia the Botanical. Say hi, Batavia.
Hi, Batavia.
There you go. Good, good, good. So if you want to support the show, you can do so by getting, I just drew a blank, by becoming a subscriber or a patron. You can also use the Amazon store. All the links are below. And we have seeds for sale. So get yourself some seeds. And we're going to do everybody a favor on this episode. We are absolutely talking about planting a garden today. So when we talk about planting, we are going to, throughout the episode, reference the Planter app. Is a long-term supporter of the show. Just click the link below and get yourself a discount on it. And throughout this episode, you'll learn more about it. So let's just do that. Yeah, this is a fun, technical, and difficult one. I think
Mhm.
you agree.
This is by far the hard. What?
If you're watching on YouTube, which by the way, if you want to support us, come watch us on YouTube. Your eyes got really big and you looked off to the side like, oh boy, here we go. You knew we were going on a journey.
Yeah, yeah. It's by far the hardest thing that I experience as a gardener, which is wild because we're talking about planting, which means that I'm not necessarily stepping foot into the garden. I do when I plan, but like how is that possible? The planning part is the hardest thing for me. And once we get down to like the second or third category that we're talking about today, you'll really understand the why. But it really it's almost counter to the way that I want to garden. Like I want to be, whimsical. I want to be kind of I'll decide on the fly, I don't want to be held down to, a particular way to do things. I want to change my mind when I change my mind. And you can grow some food with that in mind, that approach. But not what I'm trying to do. So,
No, and it's I started out the same way, but locking down that plan is important. And I think as we go through this, you know right off the bat, I said locking down your plan, but there's always adjustments that can be made, and you can change things and all that. But having an overarching goal for yourself in your garden, I think, is really important. And I think I agree with you. This is very difficult. It's one of those things. I think it's a more advanced level. You know what I mean? I
mhm.
don't really like to put like gardening in like beginner or advanced or anything like that, because I really do think that we're all always like beginner level, but we kind of step into these different techniques. But what it does is it really opens up for everybody, and it'll
Mhm.
just change the way that you're gardening across the board. Are you fanning away fungus gnats?
I am. I'm
Oh,
disappointed.
you poor
Yeah.
thing.
Mhm.
So, all right. So the first thing is, how is it possible for us to plan a garden for a whole year without even stepping into the garden, essentially? Like, that's really what we're talking about here.
Let me ask you, do you think it's
Uh-oh.
possible uh-huh. You think it's possible off track already, like, sharp left turn, right? It's like when your directions say it is a short or a sharp turn, I'm just like, "Which one is it?" Like, I have a terrible sense of direction, though. So do you believe that if I have never grown food before, that I basically am walking into my first year of gardening, do you believe that I can accomplish what we're talking about here? Can I plan for these 3 seasons, petering in 4th year?
Um, so if you've never gardened and you're just getting into it, can you plan for a 3-season garden? If you did your back research first, I think you could be on the way to it. I don't know how successful it would be. I mean, I'm going to be totally honest with you. After listening to this episode, you got a much higher chance.
Mhm,
But you need to have experience with a lot of these, and I mean, I think it's very dependent on the individual. If you understand cool season crops and warm season crops and all that stuff, I think that you can absolutely go all the way through and get some kind of harvest at
mhm,
the end of the season. Now, I don't think you'll get a full harvest, but I also am a big believer in the fact that like you got to fail in order to learn. And I think you could possibly do that. And then what I do think is the next year you could be well on your way to this. So
yeah.
it's kind of a it's kind of a crappy answer. I know that, but it is what it is. So yeah, I think you could get some kind of harvest, but I think there's always going to be a crop that's going to give you a problem. Look, I'm on my 5th year of growing Brussels sprouts and I'm finally starting to get it. So I'm right here in the same seat. I'm sitting in the passenger seat with y'all. You know what I'm saying? Y'all are driving down the road and I'm sitting there right there with you. There ain't no difference between Batavia and I and anybody else listening to this podcast. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like we all have our issues. Some people have problems with growing lettuce. Some people have problems with peppers. It's across the board. It's everything. What do you think?
Yeah, that's the interesting part where I hear people talk about, having a black thumb versus a green thumb. It seems like people either think they can do it or they just can't. Like there's no variation with it. And from what I've observed, including myself and as a gardener, I feel like if you put in a bit of work ahead before you start your planning, so you've read a bunch of things, you've seen videos, if you've I'm stopping short of saying doing your research. If you've investigated the act of gardening and then you're planning, I absolutely do believe that you can plant, plant in every season and harvest in all 3 of those seasons, spring, summer, and fall. How much you harvest for all 3 of those seasons is really to be determined, so I believe if I go back to the point of, is it really all or nothing when it comes to you coming in new as a gardener or maybe a few years as a gardener? I believe what most of us learn is there's some things that just grow wonderfully for us. And then, like you said, there's one or more crops that kind of continue to nag at us and kind of
Yeah.
give us trouble.
Well, so you said a lot there. And I like your thesaurus use for not calling it research and
Mhm.
doing all the other words. That was cool. I liked it. And if we were good podcast hosts, we would sit down and we would take our time and we would come up with like a gardener investigation series and like,
Mm, mhm,
for next winter. And maybe we'll have to do that. I don't know. Leonard, write that one down.
hmm,
Put it on the sub notes. But you brought up black thumb. Okay. I hate that term. And I'm going to
mhm,
say something pretty bold. And it's for everybody who says they have a black thumb, it's because one, you don't do your research. Two, you don't put in enough effort. And three, you don't pay attention because you can grow. You just got to figure out. And when it comes down to all of this, like the next sentence that I say, you could walk away and never listen to the show or watch any gardening content again. But if you pay attention and you methodically say, this is what happened, you go
Mhm.
and look it up and say, this is why this happened, you are going to completely eliminate problems from your garden one step at a time every single season.
Mhm.
So it is absolutely possible to do that. It's not the easiest. You know, it's definitely easier to hang out with Ben and Batavia and listen and watch a couple YouTube videos, but on your own time, if you do that, and if you do it starting in spring, because it is the first week of spring, then you
Mhm.
can really start to kind of, you know, you get all these opportunities because every plant is different, but every plant is affected in the same way by certain things. If it's wilting, there's root causes that cause wilting across the board. If it's discolored, same thing. If it's bolting, same thing. So, you know, you can figure all this stuff out. It takes
Mhm.
time, and that's why we're in the ultra marathon episode where we're going. And I mean, look, when I say ultra marathon, this episode is going to be 3 hours long, so y'all better strap in. No, it's not. It's not. I don't want to
With
talk for
aid
3 hours. Yeah,
stations, with
yeah. You don't get any Gatorade though. You just gotta have to suffer through it. But no, it's, you know, I think it's possible. I think it's difficult, but I also think if you want to do it, I think in our country, in the United States of America, and even up into Canada, all 3 seasons people can be growing something. Now,
Mhm.
what I grow, what Batavia grows, and what Billy Joe grows up in Ottawa is going to be different for fall season and spring, but it's
Yeah.
the same, you know, same concept.
Yeah, I think, there's also, like, this level of openness that you have to have as a new or experienced or anywhere in between gardener if you're aspiring to grow in 3 seasons, because you may not be growing all of your favorites in all 3 of those seasons. If you're going after volume, there are gonna be some veggies that you're probably planting, seeding, growing that, if you had to choose, maybe you wouldn't, but it fills a space and it produces something. It's interesting. I was watching someone planting their garden and they talked about some of the things they wanted to grow that was fast. And they mentioned radishes. And it's like, well, yeah, definitely. But there are not a lot of people that love radishes. It definitely is meant to be like, I'm going to grow a little bit of this. I'm going to use a little bit of these and not using radishes, you know, just generally, just thinking about what's the radish in your garden, like what's the thing that does really well for you in one or more seasons, but it's not at the very top of your list. And I think you ask yourself as a gardener, do you bother with it or not? And it depends on the year, you catch me. Sometimes I'm growing things that chard is a good example.
You're you're
I
you're
love growing chard.
you're baiting me.
I grow it, it grows well. I typically leave it in the garden longer than it should grow, like, it gets very mature, and it's not the tastiest the more mature it gets, and so I'm growing it this year, and my plan, as in most years, is to harvest it earlier, but I enjoy growing it,
Yeah.
and so there's a place for it, you know?
Well,
That helps fulfill the goal here that we're talking about.
if you look at it this way, um, and this is where I said you're baiting me, Batavia, because
Mhm.
if you go back, what are you doing?
I thought I was off camera, and I'm trying
No,
to catch
you're absolutely not. You're being really weird on camera. That's the 14-minute mark, everybody, if you want to see Batavia being weird.
I was trying to catch the fungus gnat and not interrupt the microphones because you switched to yourself, and I'm like, "I got a couple of seconds. I'm gonna get this thing." Oh,
So,
good grief.
you know, I didn't expect this episode to go down this way, but here we go. We're here.
This is
S-
what happens when he lets me he gives me, like, 2 or 3 inches, man.
yeah. So, if you think about it, and I mean, I hear what you're saying, you
Mhm.
know, but if you go back and you look, like studies have shown when they look at like historical figures and, you know, anthropologists and stuff like that look in the past, you can tell people's diets in the region and what they had
Mm,
available to them. And so
mm,
that's really where we sit at with this. And this is something that I truly believe, and Batavia and I have had many conversations about this, is you can have certain crops that grow really good in your area. And that's really what it is. We live in a time where you have access, generally speaking, to all kinds of foods across the board. But when we're growing them, it's completely different. So there's going to be some things that, like, you may just not do great in certain seasons. Like, for instance, it shouldn't take me 5 years to learn how to grow Brussels sprouts because they don't grow well in this area. But
Yeah.
because I have this, thing where we can get whatever we want, we've decided to
Mhm.
take this path and learn it. And so that's what we've been doing. And if you go back in time, I mean, it's history has proven itself over and over. There is places where people would eat radishes all the time because that's what grew, plain and simple. That's what they had the time to grow those, and they could eat a lot of them. Now they ate other things too, and if you go along the same lines, there'd be radishes and lettuces and stuff like that, turnips maybe, anything that was like a faster growing that would produce. But we have a lot of different tools to our disposal, and that's what we're trying to do, is use those tools to do this. And then the other thing I was going to bring up, because you brought up radishes, I saw a thing years ago. This is interesting. A guy went to another country and he was going to start a business with nothing. And so he took radish seeds with him, and he was going to start a radish business. And so
Mhm.
he grew like a little patch of radishes, and then he had figured it out and he'd spaced it out, his seeds. And so then he grew another patch of radishes, and a certain amount of days later, and over time grew himself in this. It was a very low income country where there was a high demand for fresh food, and he
Mhm.
was
Mhm.
able to grow a business to the point to where he could sell radishes. But and this is where we're going to get into this, he was spacing it out so that the harvest would continuously flow. And what was the key that he used for that? Days to
The planter
harvest.
app?
Well, no, days to harvest is what he was using. So days to harvest is really, really important when you're doing this. We've on this show had disagreements and then agreements and then disagreements. We go back and forth.
Mhm.
Some of us do. I'm not going to say who, but we know somebody is guilty. Um, myself. So I'm very
Mhm.
indecisive on this one, but I've learned that knowing how long it's going to take, like he knew those radishes were going to take 21 days to be harvested. So he started his radishes at 21 days. He came back 10 days later, started another batch. He came back 10 days later and started another batch. And he just kept doing it that way. And then he would have a continuous flow of radishes. So it's the same idea, but we're going into multiple seasons.
Same idea, going into multiple seasons, and keep track of my connection here. So pull me back if you find that I get wonky. Um, but that's a single crop. Even if there are
Right.
various varieties of radishes, it's a single crop. There's something to be said about, some farmers that specialize in 1 or 2 crops and that's it,
Well,
so it's a
yeah.
lot easier to manage.
Yeah, it is, but you don't have mega farmers doing, 15 different crops on a field. You know what I mean? Like they have their markets set up. But for instance, like to give an example about this days to harvesting, like I know, and when I say days to harvest, what I mean is understanding when that plant will come out of the ground. And some of them are easier than others, right? So for instance, my potatoes go in February, and then they come out in January. No, in June they come out. So I know that in June those potatoes are coming out. What's next? And so I've made that plan, and where what I've adjusted it to is the next thing is going to be cover crop, which this is a bad example to start off with, but whatever. So then I put a cover crop in, because what that gives me is that gives me ample time to figure out when to get something in. If I need to cut the cover crop back, I can, and then get something in the ground. If I need to let it sit, I can do that too. So I can use all that to my advantage. But I've got other portions of the beds worked out that way, where I have them figured out per season when things are going to come out. Like tomatoes are difficult, especially if you're going indeterminates, because they can just keep going. So then you've got to
Yeah.
start to make a judgment call.
I'm looking at the Planter app on my phone where I was checking to see what I decided that was going to come in after my garlic, and I haven't added it to the plan yet because I know when that's going to be ready. First, maybe second week of July, I'll be harvesting my garlic. But I did plan for the shallots that I'm growing, assuming that they pop and they grow and I love them. I have carrots that go in behind it, right? Same idea with I'm planting cilantro in a space and I plan on putting, so that's for spring, cool weather, cool loving crop. And I plan on putting, and it's a small little bed, bush beans after it. We have some bush beans in our shop. Check us out. So like this, that is one path when it comes to your harvest date and knowing, I know when my cilantro starts to bolt in my garden and I don't have an interest in like letting it continue to collect the seeds, coriander. I want to move on to the next crop. But when you talk about the radishes, what he was doing is succession sowing,
Yeah.
right? You know, so his days to harvest were important because he didn't wait until that 21-day mark to plant. He wanted to be able to week, once you get from that 21-day part, week to week that he'd be able to harvest, and that's the way that he's planted his garden.
Yeah.
And that absolutely applies to today's topic, guys and gals. You know, it is the best path, even if you just want to get from season to season to season,
Right.
right? You know.
Well, and yeah, because if you plant half your bed with, we'll just stick with radishes, and they're done in 21 days, like what am I supposed to just let it sit empty? No, you just replant it and go all the way
Mhm.
through until you figure out the next thing to go in.
'Cause
So
the just let me interject. The assumption is that you're still in a season where you can do a second crop of radishes, a third crop
yes,
of radishes, right?
yeah, and that's the thing. The underlying point here is understand what season you're growing in and what you're growing in that season. You know what I mean? Like follow the path and do it, but just understand it, because if you don't and you're planting, we'll stick with radishes, your radishes all the way through, and then you're getting into June and July, you're just going to kind of struggle. So understand when your plants go, and that's where that research or investigating or whatever other term you want to use is. All that stuff really does matter, because it makes a big difference. When
Yeah.
I learned that I had to get my broccoli out of the ground no later than May, that changed the game for me, because what that provided me was an opportunity to say, okay, my broccoli's coming out in May. I'm only 2 weeks after my last frost date. So I've got all the time in the world. Like, I can still put in my tomatoes, my peppers, my sweet
Mhm.
potatoes. I can put in a
Mhm.
number of things in these beds and get them going. And so that's when things started to click for me. And
Yeah.
that's what progressed me into a 4 season garden. 4 seasons kind of stretching it for me, but it does happen. Um,
Yeah.
and it's,
And
go ahead.
I was just gonna say for me, it was moving out of just growing in summer. So if I was just growing in summer, which I did for a bunch of years, I didn't really do a second planting of anything, right? So I didn't consider growing lettuce. And when I did, I didn't realize that it's the most optimal time to grow it isn't in summer, right? Some folks do have success there, but it's one of those things where not only did I think it was too cold to grow things outside of generally summer, I also didn't 12 years ago realize that there is a preference. Like, it wasn't that I didn't grow broccoli because it was a cool weather crop and I was only planting in summer. I didn't even realize a dozen years ago that broccoli really wouldn't thrive planting it in June,
Yeah.
you know? And it's interesting when you go back to the can you do this 3 season plus as a brand new gardener? Well, yeah, if you've dug in a little bit, investigated a little bit, researched a little bit. If you're able to eke out those kinds of details,
I hate you.
you know, you're able to have success in spring,
Yeah.
summer, and fall with those plants that enjoy growing in spring, summer, and fall.
Yeah. I mean, I was the same way. I didn't understand for a while that you couldn't get certain things to grow in certain times. And I remember trying to go get, a broccoli plant or something in June. And it helped me because I was like, oh, well, you can't find them. So clearly I'm not supposed to. But the problem was they would sell them up until the last minute. And then I would get them and then I would just kind of be stuck with what I was. So, with the planner app in mind and all that stuff, well, first of all, I don't like using it on my phone because it's too small. So I use it on my computer and my tablet. So I can't pull it up, but I definitely have it marked in there when things are going to go through. And what I've done between the app, the planner app, and then other ways is I've created planting groups within my garden. So what I
Mhm.
do is as I rotate through the raised beds, I have an order of plants for a number of them that will be started and grown together. And when I say
Okay.
together, what I'm referring to really is they will be, I start my Brussels sprouts, they grow, and then the next crop that goes in is going to be my squash, and then the next crop after that is going to be my garlic, and hopefully to finalize that would be my carrots would go together with that. And so that's a full year's worth of planting in that bed. And so and then the next year as that bed moves forward, I do the same thing. I move it to that. So I've created these groups, these planting groups that work well for me. And then that's helped me too. And the way I did that is it took a while, but I figured out like right now is the time of year where my Brussels sprouts are coming out of the ground. We're harvesting them, we're eating them, and then we have like a month or two before we can put in our squash. So we take our time, we let that bed rest, and then we put our squash in, and then we do, and then we just go down the line and then just keep moving it in that same direction. And it seems to work out pretty good so far. I haven't had any issue. I've definitely had some combinations that just did not work at all. So,
Yeah.
when I say doesn't work, it's for two things. Either there's no nutrients left or they don't come out of the ground in time.
So just to clarify, tell me those plants in that planting group for a single bed is what you're describing. Tell me the order again and the plant names.
No, I'm not going to do that. No.
Yeah. Well, tell us.
So you
Tell
can.
all
So
of us.
first of all, I'm going to say this. I did a whole video on it. You can go find it. It's called "Group Planting in Groups" or something like that. So you can definitely check that on Sandy Bottom Homestead. But in that particular bed, it was um, the order that it started out was Brussels sprouts into squash into garlic and then adding carrots in the spring. And then another one I have in particular. What's another one that I have? My broccoli into tomatoes and peppers, and then into radishes, um, rutabagas, and turnips. So that's another grouping that I have. And so like another one that I'm working on now, which I didn't grow onions this year. I'm a little bit upset I didn't, but not really. But if I did, it would be my garlic and onions would go in, and then my corn would go behind that because my second planting of corn would go into that if I decide to do so, because you can't be taking notes like that.
Well, I'm taking notes
This is
because I wanna you
proprietary
keep on giving me
information.
options. I wanna
I
speak
know.
on one of these, but you keep going.
Well, this is the last one. And so that would be my second corn planting because the broccoli and the onions come out at in June, so I still have time to get more in.
Mhm, mhm. So, I'll take the original one, the Brussels sprouts. Oh, I can't read my own writing. Squash, garlic, and carrots. Are garlic and carrots combined for the final planting? You said carrots in the spring, right?
It's the garlic goes in November, and then the garlic's still growing, so then I add the carrots. And you can even replace that with onions, doesn't matter.
Mhm. Okay. So obviously it's kind of like what's understood doesn't need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. You understand that this works for you because you have grown these things individually. You know the time that it takes from the point of planting it to harvest in your garden. And you're also able, just based on your experience, to say, all right, now time is after Brussels sprouts are harvested, it's time for the squash, right? And you have timed how long your squash really thrives in the garden, and then you look up and say, "Hey, I need to plant garlic somewhere. Let me go ahead and use that." Being able to get 3 plus crops out of a garden bed. I'm only saying 3 because you're moving into the next year for one of these. 3 plus crops out of one garden bed is it's like it's masterful level, right? Now the key here is what if someone really doesn't want to grow Brussels sprouts and squash and garlic and carrots? Maybe that's not their dream garden, which I can appreciate you giving us a couple more examples of it. It's not necessarily those crops for you, but it's that concept, right?
Yeah.
Figuring that piece out and deciding what are your 3 crops, what are your 4 crops that are gonna follow each other basically.
Well, I think the unfortunate thing is when I say stuff like that, people think I'm giving them a planting plan, and that's not what I'm
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason why I say that is I started this, and no, it is not because I was successful, because I started this when I was failing at Brussels sprouts. The
Mhm.
way it evolved was with in conjunction with experience, the planter app, research, and all these things. What I figured out was, okay, you don't like Brussels sprouts, fine. What is the key with Brussels sprouts? They love nitrogen, right? They use a lot of nitrogen. So replace any plant with that, any plant. And then what's the key with squash? It doesn't need a lot of nitrogen. Okay, perfect, right? So what's the key with garlic and carrots? They don't need a lot of nitrogen either, but they're root vegetables. So they're using more, I got to say right, potassium than the previous. So that's kind of how that unfolded. And then you combine that with the amount of time that they grow and the time of year they come out, and then you start to get your groupings.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if I was replace a nitrogen hungry crop from Brussels sprouts, let's pick lettuce. May not
Mhm.
be the best because I will, I'll get bolting and stuff like that. So, it you could pick like cabbage, broccoli, stuff like that. Here's another one I came up with this year, and I love this. In the greenhouse, you remember how I was doing the test for the carrots? Or
Mhm.
not the carrots, the potatoes in the fall. So I grew them in the
Oh,
fall.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I grew them in the fall. I got a piss poor harvest. I mean,
Mm.
be honest, I left the potatoes sitting in there and ruined them after I harvested them. But I harvested them, and then I was like, okay. And I was just trying to see what was going to happen. And so then I replanted them. Well, then they got burnt by when it got cold in the greenhouse one night. So then I
Mhm.
pulled those out. But then I turned around and I put broccoli in. Broccoli is doing great. Potassium loving um, potatoes with nitrogen hungry broccoli. So next year on the other side of the greenhouse in the fall is going to be potatoes, and then after that it's going to be the broccoli. And I've got that every year that's what that's going to be, that
Mhm.
combination. So the only reason why I can't do that out in my garden though is because they grow at the same time in the garden. So I can't do it out there. So that I stumbled into that one.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
when I sat back and looked at it, I was like, well, these are the reasons why, and this works out great. So cool, let's do it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think but that's quite literally trial and error.
Yeah, exactly. And that's some things exactly you can't do. And
Mhm.
that one's a little bit higher level because of the greenhouse scenario
Yeah.
where I mean, you're altering the temperatures and stuff like that. So,
Yep. Mhm.
and I'm only one
Creating
year
a
into it. So it could be completely different next year based on our weather in the greenhouse.
Yeah, creating a false environment almost. We were talking in our episode around your seed starting shelves, and I had an aha moment when you talked about your conveyor belt. I'm just going to keep on dripping on you all so I can keep on dripping on myself. This all depends on success, that is, on the timing of all of this, right? So for me, tomatoes may be the second crop in that family that would go into the garden, and for years and years, tomato was the last thing that basically I'd pull out of my garden, period. Like, here we are with freezing temps. And one of the things I've come to terms with over the last couple of years is the quality, kicking and screaming, let's be real. The quality of those tomatoes towards the latter part of the season aren't the best. And so if I need a space and I'm willing to pull those tomatoes, earlier, I'm able to get that 3rd crop in that same growing space. That's again unlocking a code for me in my garden. But all of that depends on how early the earliest crop went in, which
Right.
meant I was able to get a harvest from, let's say, lettuce and bok choy. And then I put tomatoes after that. And then I came back in and maybe not cabbage, maybe I did another round of leafy greens. Maybe it was arugula and lettuce on the back end of it as the third kind of set of crops. Like it's you play around with it. You're still able to get, if you're especially using multiple planting spaces, multiple garden beds, multiple containers, you're still able to get a variety. There's diversity that's going to be in your garden if you take this approach.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm always striving for these groupings and stuff like that because it
Mhm.
makes this completely easier. Now, we need to get into the difficult part,
Mhm.
and that's leaving a gap in the garden. Okay. Let me say this. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of jump between this and the next one. Um, and it's you've made a plan, you've sat down, you've done your research, and you know, like, hey, this is how this is going to go. This plant needs this. This plant comes out now. We're going to do this. Once you make that plan, stick to that plan because you have to remember the whole goal of this is to go from spring planting all the way to fall. That's what through fall. That's what you want with this in mind. So when we're doing this, you got to think about it and you got to say, okay, we're going to have, it's going to be a little bit of a gap here. I don't have monocropping. What would be polycropping? Maybe what is a technical
Mhm.
term you could use for that? I don't know,
For the
but
multiple vegetables at the
yeah,
same
like
time?
multi-cropping vegetable. Like I've got a
Mhm.
bed right now that's got one row's got kale, another row's got mustard, another row's got or two rows have lettuce. So
Mhm.
in theory, the lettuce is going to come out earlier. Now I have to look at that and say, do I have time to start more lettuce
Yeah.
or do I let it sit? That's the key. But what else can we do in that space? Well, I still have another month after I've harvested my lettuce, maybe before the other things come out. Can I put radishes in there or something like
Mhm.
that? But what's the ultimate goal to go in after that? So, in that particular bed, my ultimate goal is tomatoes and peppers. So, I know I have time for that. So, if it has to sit empty, it's
Yeah.
okay. Don't think you've got to jam it full of stuff to the tune of like think about it this way, you're now graduating into like intensive gardening. um Take that little break in the soil and just let it do its thing, let it sit there and rest and charge and feed it and do all that, and then go to plant afterwards, and that's going to make a huge difference for yourself when you go move forward.
Yeah, it's a throwback too as well, the days to harvest. If you're planting a mixed bed is what how I generally refer to it, multiple crops in the same garden space, and they're not all being harvested at the same time. It's a lot easier when you have vegetables that, like your root crops, your sweet potatoes, your regular potatoes, your onions, things, carrots. Generally speaking, all of them can be harvested at the same time, and now you have a clear space. That's easier to manage when you're talking about what comes next compared to what you were describing. This happened to me a couple of years ago where I still had peppers growing in the bed. I had pulled a row of onions at the edge of the bed out, and I tried to put lettuce behind it because I was going into late summer, early fall. And guess what? Those little pepper plants that were like 2.5, 3 feet tall continued to show out, and the lettuce was like, "I mean, what you want me to do?" Like, like,
Yeah.
"What do you really want me to do?" And so that was a poor kind of grouping, when it came to what's next. I could have instead pulled a couple of those pepper plants and had an open space and gave everything I was growing next a better chance. I could have planted squash in that space, which generally speaking would be done sooner. I mean, when I say done, I mean like it's probably gonna die, a tragic death. And then I can clear that space and plant kind of the third crop for the season. But I mean, that's you have to be very intentional about your planning here, understanding what likes to grow well together, which is what we oftentimes talk about, like what's the companion planting of it all, but also what's the timing of it all. And do you want to use that space for something else afterwards?
Yeah, that's it's all part of the your ultimate goal and plan. And
Mhm.
that's why we were talking about the planner app throughout the whole episode, because what I do is I have each year I have 3 different profiles made, and it shows each different season. So spring,
Mm.
fall, or spring, summer, and then fall. And fall invariably for me drags into winter. Drags into winter. I mean, look, it'll be the first day of spring, and I guarantee you I will be harvesting something I planted in fall. So, that will be there, but I can go through and switch back and forth and look. And that's a really important tool to use, because as you get into this and you get out of the, as Batavia likes to say it, the whimsicalness of all of this, and we start getting a little bit more technical as you'd like to get. And look, I
Mhm.
realize between the two of us, I'm probably 100 times more technical than you are, but I think you're undercover technical, Batavia. I think you're undercover. I can
You have to
sense
be
it.
to do the work that we're doing here,
You do, you do,
it's
and I know the
I take an
desire,
opportunity to try to simplify things probably more often
and
than
I
is
think it's important to do that too,
mhm.
because not everybody understands. I don't want to say understand. Not everybody thinks like, you know, A, B, C, D, but once you start to break it down, it gets a little bit different. But what I found out through all of this is once I enacted my plan, it gets on cruise control and you
Mhm,
start going.
mhm,
And so like you're talking about planting things a little bit different this year and spacing it out. And that was really the first step for me too, because I didn't have that mad dash where I was out there till 10 o'clock at night stressing out planting. And I had
mhm,
it a little bit
mhm.
easier and more spaced out. So it wasn't so overwhelming. But leaving the gaps was a real issue for me. And so the one thing I will say about that, you get a plant that dies, you get a plant that gets sick, and you got to yank it. First of all, if it's sick and you can't repair it, yank it. Just saying, pro level advice. And that's a tough pill to swallow, but find another crop that you can stick in there. I mean, that's why we started selling seeds, was because we started last year with seeds that were meant for that,
Mhm.
bush beans, squash. What else did we start? I don't even remember now, but whatever. We started with these quick growing, direct sowing crops that the whole idea was my tomato plant didn't make it. I can jam in that same 4 square foot space, I can put 4 bean plants,
Mhm, mhm.
bush bean plants, and take advantage of it. But when you do that, be prepared to remove that plant to keep your next season going, because invariably what's going to be happening is it's going to start getting cold and these plants are going to produce as well, and what's going to happen is the plants that you should have put in are going to be producing at their highest level at that moment,
Mhm.
and you want to catch that moment, and that's where things will start to change for you.
Yeah, I wanna add one additional note, and it's something I've been working on the last few years. It's if you're transplanting things in after this first season, meaning spring, many of us are starting seeds indoors and transplanting them out, and then as the weather changes, I'd say that some of us shift to doing more direct seeding, direct sowing. So if you're planning for summer and then planning for fall, you need to determine when those plants need to get into the garden. So if you're direct sowing, when that direct sowing needs to happen under the most ideal scenario that you can create in your garden. If you're transplanting, you need to be able to determine when that transplant goes in, which obviously means you're doing math to determine when that seed needs to be sown indoors or outside if you're doing it in a separate area. That's, everything we know and learn and love about seed starting at the beginning of the year. We apply those same lessons too when we're trying to start stuff for summer, start
Yeah.
stuff for fall.
Well, and one thing I love about gardening is it's simple math intensive and it's scientific intensive.
Mhm.
There's a lot of science behind what we're doing here if you
Sure.
really start to break it down. And in light of what Batavia said, look, I have been on YouTube preaching about planting earlier. And people are starting to say, and you're going to see it here in a second, that what I've been saying has been working.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, when you start to do this, and I'm going to be completely honest here, you got to stop messing around with your planting dates. If you're going to do it and you want to plan a year-long garden, you've got to nail down your planting dates and get them right. That is the most important part because, again, if I plant my broccoli late and it bolts in May, then I've literally just planted a crop so I could watch it flower. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not doing me a damn bit of good, you know. And after so
No.
many years of doing it, it's like, okay, why did it bolt? It bolted because it got too hot. Well, how do I prevent it from doing that? Well, let me go back and plant it earlier so it's not growing in the heat. It's not an accident, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a reason why these things happen. And all of this is like the culmination of like everything together. But this is how you do it. And this is how they did it in the past when, you know, like my granny, may she rest in peace, was if we didn't grow it, we didn't eat it. Well, you know, they
Mm-hmm.
weren't planting broccoli in May. You know, they were out there as early as they could, sticking their broccoli in the ground or whatever the hell they were growing. They lived off of turnips. Why did they live off of turnips? Because that's what grew here in the wintertime. But you got to understand that when you start.
Yeah.
There's a reason why collards are so popular in the South. I'm going to tell you why they're popular, how we know, because we can't keep them in the damn store. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a
Mm-hmm.
reason why, because they grow throughout the winter here. It is a solid food source throughout the
Yeah.
winter. Even as much as kale sucks, same thing. It's a solid food source throughout the winter.
Yep.
There it is. Okay. We got to go to the question of the day. You ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, I know you are. Okay, let me pull it up. Let me pull it up. So this question comes from Facebook. If I can get my computer to act right, I will read it to you. So on Facebook, Community Gardens, Backyard Gardens Community Garden, join it for free. Come join the club. Helena wrote, "Whoa, look at the difference. The bigger basil was started merely 4 days ago, and the ones in the cells, the bigger basil, also spent time under what I'm assuming is a more powerful grow light. Same starting mix, same watering, same temps, same fan. I wonder how much the difference has to do with the light or if starting them in cells really does slow them down. I'm also taking seed starting tips from the podcast, made such a huge difference. Hats off to the experience and wisdom of Ben in Batavia. Heart emoji."
Hey, Helena. Thank you for the compliment and congratulations on the beautiful basil. I thought I read that it wasn't that they were started 4 days ago, but there was a 4-day gap between when they were started in the seed sales versus
Yes, it was.
the
I'm
larger
sorry.
pot.
It was 4 days before
Okay.
the ones in the larger pot.
Pot is
Shout out to the spacing episode.
so. Uh-huh, uh-huh. It's I don't know. What do you think? Like maybe an inch to 2 inches tall for those that haven't seen her picture on for the plants for the seed cells, and then she has maybe a 3 or 4 inch pot that has probably 4 or 5
Yeah.
inches as far as height
Yeah.
goes for the basil. And uh, the stronger light she believes was on the basically the taller
No.
basil, and the
It
weaker
was
light
it
was the
was the
opposite.
same light, same watering, same seed starting mix. Everything was the
Hmm.
same. She thinks the
Hmm.
potting makes a difference.
Okay. You sure?
Yep. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll let you continue to
Well, hold on.
answer
Wait,
while
wait,
I
wait, wait,
double
wait,
check
wait.
your facts here.
She says she assumes one of them is a more powerful grow light. So
Yeah.
when you go through this and you look at it, there's a couple things. One, a stronger grow light can make that's a drastic difference. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's drastic to look at. And so what I will say is, if it's the stronger grow light, that absolutely has something to do with it. But are you looking at it?
Yeah, that was me looking at it, showing them I'm looking at
Can you blow up the
it.
picture so people can see it on YouTube?
Let's see. You know, I have so many things going on here,
I know
brother.
you do.
All right, go ahead for the people at YouTube. Oh, good grief.
I know. I hate that.
Uh-huh.
Lift it up a little bit.
Uh,
Whatever. You
I
see
can't
it.
figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I actually stole her picture. So go ahead, get your answer, and then you can come back to me, and I'll actually have.
So Batavia stole the picture, so you can just watch as she puts it on her Instagram as if it was her own that she did it.
Oh, wait. Oh, good grief.
Oh
This is
my
too much.
goodness. There you go.
There you go.
So there's a big difference, as you can see. Shout out to the actual the spacing episode, because the space can make a big difference. And this is how you can use things to your advantage. So if you go to Facebook, and we're not going to do that debacle again about looking at the picture, but if you look at it, Batavia, what's one thing you notice about that picture? Like overall between the two, what do you notice?
The plants in the larger pot, and that actually is probably larger than even 4 inches. That's a pretty big pot. She has maybe 5 or 6, and there's 2 inches in between every stem that I can see. Where those that are in crowding, it looks like the ones that are in the seed cell. And there's some spotted
Right. I
germination
see that.
too.
But what I
Yeah.
also see is there's 4 plants in the pot, and in the same space that that pot takes up, there's 15 plants started. So that's what I
Mm-hmm.
see. So,
Mm-hmm.
this is a tool that we can use to control the growth of the plant. So you can use your lights, the amount of light that you use, the strength of the light, and the space in the pot. So, yes, she's got some really good looking stuff in that 4-inch pot, but in that same diameter, there's about 15 plants available that are invariably going to grow much larger.
Yep.
So if you're looking at it overall as an amount in harvest, those smaller plants will end up getting you more harvest. So, um,
Basically walked into succession planting,
yeah,
really, right?
I
So
mean,
the
yeah,
larger ones are going to be the ones that go out, I'm sure, first in her garden,
yeah,
and then she'll have these smaller plants that will be growing a little bit, slower. Eventually, they're all going to catch up once we get into the spring and summer of it all. But really, I don't. It didn't feel like she did this on purpose.
no,
It just happened to be that she started these things, in different containers 4 days apart. But I love it. I love
yeah.
it all.
So one year I took, I think I've said this before, but I took basil and I put it in. I had little plastic cups like this big, the little clearish ones. And my goal was every plant that I sold, I was going to give away a basil plant. So I opened up the seeds, and I didn't realize they were basically dust. So I just sprinkled them on, and next thing I know, I probably had 50 plants
Yeah.
in each cup, but they were minuscule. So I took
Mhm.
those, I grew them for a while, and then I broke them into sections of like 6, and then stuck those in another pot and let them grow out. And
Mhm.
I mean, I ended up having the exact same basil as if I would have gone to. As a matter of fact, I had more basil than if I had gone to the store and bought a pre-made plant, because that stuff just grows so fast. So it was
Yeah.
another way, and I've used that method ever since that I stumbled into it. And I've
Yeah.
used that method where I'll just take a seed cell or two and just cram them full, and then just break them apart and use them. So it's definitely a
Basil,
method.
it's such a great herb for summer because it's not as slow as the rest of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is something that's gonna grow generally all throughout the summer. Some varieties do bolt faster than others, so keep that in mind. The Genovese basil we have in the shop is a very commonly grown basil. It's forgiving, potting up, separating, continually, planting in a succession form, similar to what our question of the day, what she did, and leave those things and fragrant, which is one of the things I'm focusing on coming into the new garden season. You see me getting all warm and
So
fishy
it's
inside.
funny because I was waiting for you. I wanted to shout out Wanda because her comment was, I can smell this post, because absolutely you could smell it if you walk into the room.
Hey, Wanda.
So, but yeah, use these tools and for these methods. And one thing I've learned as we've done these series of episodes lately, one thing that I've learned is we have a lot more control over our gardens than we ever could have imagined, especially when it comes to seed
Mm.
starting. We can
Mhm,
we
mhm.
can manage it in many, many different ways. So I'm starting to learn that. Like, I know we've talked about it, but like seeing
Yeah.
it time and time again, it's starting to really hit home that like this is gonna make a big difference. We can really You can change the game if you really start thinking about it and moving it down, going that way. But if you only wanted to
Yeah.
start one plant, I would just do a 4-inch pot. You know what I mean? Like, I clearly,
I've
especially
done that.
go ahead.
I've done that almost from a decorative way. I have a little table on my back deck, and it's a pretty white pot, and I can't remember if I direct sowed or transplanted itty bitty basil plants, but either way, everything started off small, of course, and then things just got really big and bushy. And again, it's one of the things that you kind of smell as soon as you walk out the back door. So I do want to comment really quickly because you opened this box. We do have much more control than almost we speak about in our gardens, but I oftentimes hear us say things like you can't fight nature, right? And that's true. We can't fight, rain, and kind of the disaster of nature. So I'm not going to put that in a box. We can't fight how much rain we get, but generally speaking, if you investigate, you kind of know how much rain you get in your area or that you don't get, and you can make moves to work around that. I think once we can nail down all of those pieces, the surprises are even more manageable, right?
Yeah.
And that's the part that there's a level of ownership that we have to take, and we don't talk about it often because sometimes we don't want to take that ownership, you know.
Yeah, I will say this. I talk about planting earlier, and essentially what that means is getting into the danger zone.
Mhm,
But what
mhm,
I'll tell you is with the right techniques, if you play with fire, you're gonna get burned. But I got burn cream, and I ain't gonna get burned as bad because I'm using these things as pr- low tunnels, shade
mm.
covers, fertilizers, all these tools you're using, you're minimizing that burn. So yeah, it's definitely something you got to do. But look, again, just like we opened up, you got to fail in order to learn. You don't.
Yeah,
Nobody learns from 100% success. I've learned
agreed.
more lessons in my life when I've done something wrong than when I got it right the first time. And that's why everybody shouldn't get a trophy. And if you'd like to support the Backyard Gardens podcast, please do so by becoming a subscriber, getting patron, getting some seeds from us. Definitely come check us out on YouTube. At that 14-minute mark, you gotta go see Batavia. She was being super weird.
Well,
It was
we'll talk about
amazing.
the happiness around you catching a moment super weird on
Yeah.
camera.
So, and then you can come to the After Dark show where you see me getting yelled at. So we'll have that posted. No, we won't have that. That's private. But thank you everybody for listening to us. And remember, on this show we do two things: we learn to grow, and we grow for change.
See ya.